The morning was just beginning to stir when the garbage truck rolled through the quiet neighborhood. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the sleepy streets. But amid the usual mundane routine of trash collection, something unusual caught the attention of Michael, the veteran garbage man who had been doing his rounds for over 15 years. He had seen it all: broken furniture, forgotten memories, and the odd oddity tossed carelessly away. But that morning, as he steered the truck down Maple Street, something in the distance made him slow down. A woman, alone, standing by her trash can. She wasn't just taking out the garbage like any other resident. She was sobbing uncontrollably. Her shoulders shook with every muffled cry. At first, Michael thought she might just be having a bad day, maybe a little overwhelmed by the early hour. But there was something more. Something in the way she stood there, defeated and vulnerable, that made Michael pause. As he neared the house, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of unease. He was just doing his job, yet he found himself drawn to the scene before him. The woman, her face hidden by her hands, was clearly distraught. She seemed to be in her late 20s, with dark, tangled hair falling around her face. The trash can beside her, usually an innocuous thing, now seemed like an ominous presence, as if it held the weight of whatever burden had caused her tears. Michael tried to shake off the sense of dread that was creeping up his spine. It wasn't his place to get involved in people's personal lives, especially on his early morning shift, but there was something about her distress that gnawed at him. Maybe it was the sheer loneliness she exuded, or maybe it was the quiet despair in her every movement. As he stepped out of the truck to grab the trash bags, he couldn't help but glance back at the woman, his eyes locked on the large black trash bag she had just placed by the curb. There was something odd about it. Not just the bag itself, but the way she had tossed it out with such haste. It was bulky, misshapen, and unfamiliar, almost as if there was something inside that didn't belong there. He felt a twinge of curiosity, but also an uneasy pull. What could be in that bag? As he reached for the lever to lift the trash bin into the compactor, his eyes flicked back to her. She had stopped crying, but her expression was even more unsettling now. She was staring at the bag with a look of horror, a look that seemed to plead for something. Michael couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What had she thrown away? Why did she look so terrified? Before he could give it much thought, the press on the truck kicked into motion, crushing the contents of the trash bag. The sound of the compactor's gears turning echoed down the empty street, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal again. But Michael wasn't prepared for what came next. There was a sudden strange noise, almost like a muffled pop. And for a second, everything froze. The truck came to a stop. Michael's hand was still on the lever, but his mind was racing. He had heard something wrong. He rushed to the back of the truck, his heart pounding. The press had done its job, but the noise, it lingered in his mind. Was something in that bag? Something that shouldn't have been. Michael couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. He leaned over the compactor, trying to see past the mess of garbage, but the contents were hidden beneath a thick pile of crushed cans and discarded paper. His breath caught in his throat as he noticed a red stain that had spread over the top of the pile. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable once seen. The woman had vanished. She wasn't standing by the curb anymore. In fact, Michael could no longer see her anywhere. His stomach dropped. Had she known what was inside that bag? Was she trying to hide something, or worse, had she been trying to get rid of it? He took a step back, his hands trembling as he thought about the stain. A sickening feeling settled in his gut as he tried to make sense of the scene. The woman was gone. The truck was silent, and the bag had been crushed. What had been inside it? And more importantly, what had happened to the woman? His mind raced with the possibilities, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just an ordinary morning for a garbage man. Michael felt a creeping sense of dread take over. There was more to this than a simple trash pickup. The question was, what was he going to do next? Michael stood there, staring at the compactor, still unsure of what he had just witnessed. His mind raced, and his eyes darted back to the now empty street. The woman was nowhere to be found, and the only thing left to indicate she had been there at all was the trash can, still sitting open and abandoned. He felt a strange compulsion to follow her, to find out what had happened, but something held him back. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the growing sense that he had just uncovered something far darker than he was prepared for. He glanced at the truck's rearview mirror, his fingers still hovering over the lever, unsure whether to continue his rounds or investigate further. There was no denying the gnawing feeling in his stomach, the unease that wouldn't go away. It was as though the events had shifted something inside him, pulling him into a deeper mystery he hadn't asked for. Against his better judgment, Michael made a snap decision. He turned off the truck and stepped off the platform, walking towards the curb where the trash had been left behind. As he approached, his eyes fixed on the black bag, he had to know what had caused that noise. He had to know what was inside it. It wasn't just his curiosity. Something told him he couldn't just walk away from this, no matter how unsettling it seemed. He reached for the bag, hesitated for a second, and then pulled it open with a quick tug. The contents spilled out onto the street, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. There, buried beneath the crumpled trash, was a cell phone. Not just any phone, a cracked and weathered one that seemed out of place among the refuse. His heart skipped a beat as he reached down to grab it. It was still on. The screen flickered to life, showing an unsent message. The words barely legible. He's watching. He knows. Michael's pulse raced. What did it mean? Who was watching? And more importantly, why had this phone been thrown away in such a hasty, desperate manner? He stood there, holding the phone, staring at the cryptic message, when he heard something. A distant sound of footsteps approaching. Michael's first instinct was to hide the phone, but it was too late. A figure appeared at the end of the street, walking quickly toward him. It was the woman. But she wasn't walking casually. She was moving with purpose, and her face, which had been clouded with tears earlier, was now a mask of fear. She locked eyes with Michael, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. He saw it in her eyes, the same terror that had been in her expression when she stood by the trash can. She was afraid, terrified. She wasn't just avoiding something, she was running from it. Before Michael could say anything, she was upon him, her breath ragged. "You can't have that phone," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. It's dangerous." Michael took a step back, his mind racing. What's going on? Who are you running from? What's in the bag? The woman's eyes darted around nervously, as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. "You don't know what you've done," she said, almost frantic. "You've seen it now, and now you're in it too." She grabbed the phone from his hands, and her fingers brushed against his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. He opened his mouth to ask more questions, but she was already backing away. "Please, just go. Leave it. Leave me," she said, her voice growing quieter with each word. "You don't want to get involved. Not with him. Not with any of this." Before Michael could stop her, she turned and ran, disappearing down the street. A sense of confusion and dread settled over him, but a new thought began to take root in his mind. Who was she talking about? Who was he? And why did she seem To think Michael had just made some irreversible mistake by finding the phone. Michael stood in the street for several long moments, the phone still clutched in his hand. He didn't know what to do next. His mind was reeling, the phone's ominous message still playing over and over in his head. What did it mean? He needed answers, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he was already deeper in this than he could have imagined. The phone buzzed in his hand, breaking his thoughts. He jumped slightly and glanced at the screen. There was a new notification. It was a picture, a blurry, almost unrecognizable image of someone standing in the shadows. But the thing that struck him the most was the faint red tint that colored the image. Michael's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a photo. It was a warning. Without thinking, he unlocked the phone and tapped the screen. The message that appeared next made his breath catch in his throat. "He's coming for you too." Suddenly, a car screeched around the corner, and Michael instinctively ducked behind the nearest hedge. His heart pounded in his chest as the vehicle slowed down and stopped just in front of the curb. The driver's side window rolled down, and Michael could see a man sitting behind the wheel. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in shadow. The man's eyes locked onto Michael, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Michael's entire body went rigid. He had no idea who this man was, but he knew one thing. Something was very, very wrong. And the worst part, Michael couldn't help but feel that the man was waiting for him to make a move. Michael's body was frozen in place as the man in the car continued to stare at him through the darkened window. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind that hung heavily, as if everything around them had paused in anticipation. The man's gaze was piercing, intense. Michael's heart thudded against his chest, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. Who was this guy? Why was he here? And what did he want with him? The man in the car didn't speak right away, which only made the tension grow. Michael's mind was racing. He could feel the words on the tip of his tongue, but none of them seemed to make sense. In the moment, he was trapped. His eyes flicked to the phone still in his hand, and for the first time, he understood that the cryptic message from the woman, the warning about him, wasn't just about her. It was about him too. The man leaned slightly forward in his seat, his face still partially obscured by shadows. Then, in a voice so calm it sent chills through Michael, he spoke. "You found it, didn't you? The phone, the one that shouldn't have been touched." His words hung in the air like a threat, but also like an invitation to something far darker. Michael's pulse quickened. He took a shaky step back, unsure if he should run or stay, and face whatever this man had in store. He glanced down at the phone again. The image of the red tint still burned into his memory. Before he could respond, the man in the car continued. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into. This isn't just some random act. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. There's no going back now." The man's cryptic words felt like a punch to the gut, and Michael could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. He didn't ask for this. He didn't ask to be dragged into whatever this was, but somehow he was already too deep, and there was no easy way out. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just a bystander. He was now part of a much larger story, and the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. Just as Michael was about to speak, there was a sudden movement from behind the car, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was the woman. She was back, but she was different. Her eyes were wide, frantic, her face pale, and she was holding something, a black envelope. She rushed toward the car, completely ignoring Michael. The man in the car turned to her, and for a brief moment, There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by something darker. He opened the door, his movements swift and calculated, and without saying a word, he reached for the envelope in her hands. Michael stood there, confused, as the woman hesitated for a split second, then handed it over. The man quickly took the envelope, his fingers brushing against hers in a way that made Michael's stomach churn. Without a word, the man shoved the envelope into his coat pocket and turned back to Michael. "You don't need to know everything," he said, his tone now colder, more threatening. "But if you're smart, you'll forget you ever saw us." Michael's mind was reeling. What was in that envelope? What was going on here? He had so many questions, but the answers felt out of reach, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was bad, and it was all connected to the mysterious phone. The woman took one last look at Michael before she turned and began walking away, her footsteps echoing through the street. As she disappeared into the night, Michael was left with more questions than answers. Who was she really? What was the phone? What did it have to do with the man in the car? The car's engine roared to life, pulling Michael from his thoughts. The man in the car didn't look back as he drove off, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Michael stood there, still holding the phone, his mind struggling to make sense of everything that had happened. And then it hit him. The words on the phone. He knows. It wasn't just a warning about someone else. It was a warning about the man in the car. And now, Michael realized he was involved in something far beyond his control. He couldn't go back to his old life. The secrets were too deep, the stakes too high. With the weight of the phone in his hand, Michael turned away from the street, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, but knowing one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same. As he walked away, the phone buzzed once more, a final message appearing on the screen. It was from the woman, a single line of text: "Trust no one." The words lingered in his mind as he disappeared into the night, the mystery unresolved, but the truth clearer than ever. He was in it now, whether he liked it or not, and whatever was coming next, he wasn't ready.